On August 10th, 2025, in the quiet stillness of a Texas night, Bobby Whitlock, the man whose music shaped an entire era, took his final breath. Just weeks earlier, few even knew the blues rock legend was battling cancer. But those who did say the fight was short, fierce, and deeply private. As tributes pour in from Eric Clapton, George Harrison's family, and fans worldwide, one question hangs in the air. How did a man who co-wrote Layla and played on some of rock's most iconic albums slip so far out of the public eye, only to return in headlines at the moment of his death? Today, we uncover the real story. From the poverty-stricken streets of Memphis, to secret recording sessions with rock royalty, to the mysteries that followed him to the very end. This is Bobby Whitlock's untold final chapter. If you care about music history, or the legends who never got their full share of the spotlight, stay with me until the end. You'll never hear Layla the same way again. It was 1:20 a.m. in their Texas home when Coco Caramel, Bobby's wife and musical partner, held his hand for the last time. The room was quiet. No hospital beeps, no flashing lights, just the soft hum of a life lived to its fullest winding down. His battle with cancer had been brief, almost as if he didn't want the world to watch him fade. Coco later wrote, "He went from abject poverty in the South to heights unimagined, to a loving husband and an inspired artist to the very end." It wasn't just a farewell. It was a love letter to a man who spent decades pouring his soul into every note he played. The news broke hours later. Fans woke up to headlines they never expected, and friends like Eric Clapton posted heartfelt tributes, calling him our dear friend and remembering the music they created together. But behind those tributes lay a quieter truth. Bobby Whitlock hadn't been in the public eye for years. Why had he stepped back? And what happened in those years before the final curtain? That story starts decades earlier, on the streets of Memphis. Long before the fame, before the world even knew his name, Bobby Whitlock was just a kid growing up in the tough neighborhoods of Memphis. Money was scarce, but music was everywhere, bleeding out of open church doors, spilling from jukeboxes and smoky bars, and echoing in the soul clubs that defined the city's sound. By his teens, Bobby had a voice roughened by experience and a natural gift for the keys. That raw talent caught the attention of Stax Records, the powerhouse label behind Otis Redding, Booker T, and the MGs, and Sam and Dave. In a groundbreaking move, Stax signed Bobby as their first white recording artist, a decision that raised eyebrows but proved prophetic. Immersed in the label's soul-rich environment, Bobby wasn't just learning how to play. He was absorbing the heartbeat of American music. He was mentored by legends, pushed to find his own style, and surrounded by some of the most influential musicians of the era. But his time at Stax was just the ignition. Soon, Bobby would find himself swept into a whirlwind tour that would change the trajectory of his career and lead him to one of the most legendary partnerships in rock history. That pivotal Stax Records signing was just the beginning of a whirlwind. It was there that Bobby Whitlock was discovered by the rising rock duo Delaney and Bonnie, who were assembling a new backing band for their tour. This was no ordinary band. It was a rotating cast of some of the most influential musicians of the era, who would soon be known as Friends. At different times, their lineup included legends like Duane Allman, George Harrison, and Leon Russell. For a young man from a life of poverty, this was a rock and roll masterclass, and Whitlock soaked it all in. He quickly became a core part of their sound, contributing his soulful voice and powerful keyboard work. It was in this incredible musical family that he would meet another young musician, a guitarist who had already achieved global fame with Cream and Blind Faith, but was searching for a new sound. That man was Eric Clapton. The two instantly connected, sharing a deep bond over their love for the raw, bluesy, gospel-infused music that was the heart and soul of the Delaney and Bonnie sound. Little did they know, this friendship would soon give birth to one of rock's most iconic, and tragically short-lived supergroups. It was 1969 when Bobby's life took a sharp turn. After leaving Stax, he joined Delaney and Bonnie, a husband and wife duo whose touring band was a revolving door for some of the best musicians alive. One of those musicians was a soft-spoken guitar genius named Eric Clapton. The two clicked almost instantly. Bobby's gritty, soulful voice and mastery of the keys were the perfect counterpart to Clapton's melodic guitar and blues instincts. They began writing together, crafting songs that felt both urgent and timeless. When Clapton decided to step out from the shadows of his supergroup projects, he turned to Bobby, along with Carl Radle and Jim Gordon, to form Derek and the Dominos. The chemistry was undeniable. In smoky studios and late-night jam sessions, they built a sound that blended blues, rock, and raw emotion in a way no one had quite heard before. But what came next would etch Bobby's name into music history. The creation of Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs, an album born from obsession, heartbreak, and unfiltered creativity, and one that would forever carry Bobby's fingerprints on nearly every track. When people hear Layla, they think of Eric Clapton's searing guitar riff, but Bobby Whitlock's fingerprints are all over that record in ways most fans don't realize. He co-wrote nearly half the songs on Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs, pouring his own heartbreak and personal battles into the lyrics. Tracks like Bell Bottom Blues, Why Does Love Got to Be So Sad, and Any Day carry his signature, a mix of gospel soul and gut punch rock. And then there's the famous piano coda at the end of Layla. For decades, Bobby's role in shaping that moment was often overlooked or misattributed, despite his presence and influence in the sessions. The album itself was a raw confession, born out of Clapton's unrequited love for Pattie Boyd, George Harrison's wife, a complicated emotional triangle Bobby witnessed up close. In the studio, that tension fueled creativity. Songs came alive, not because they were polished, but because they were real, messy, aching, and human. Layla didn't hit big at first, but over time it became a rock masterpiece. Yet, even as its legend grew, Bobby rarely got the same spotlight as Clapton. That gap in recognition would follow him for decades, and it's part of why his later career took such an unexpected turn. The formation of Derek and the Dominos seemed like a dream come true, but behind the scenes, a nightmare was brewing. Despite their undeniable musical genius and the creation of their landmark album, Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs, the pressure was immense. As Whitlock himself would later admit, the band was a rock and roll band with a lot of heavy emotional SHT. Clapton's unrequited love for his friend George Harrison's wife, Pattie Boyd, was the most obvious source of turmoil, fueling the heartache and passion on the album. But that wasn't the only struggle. The band's lifestyle was spiraling out of control. Whitlock openly spoke about the enormous amount of drugs they were scoring for their tour. He recalled one instance where he and Clapton were in a limousine with a huge pile of blow between them, noting, "That was the beginning of the end for the two of us." The music was brilliant, but the intense pressure and the heavy substance use were taking a toll, planting the seeds for the band's tragic and sudden demise. The band's implosion was as fast and furious as their rise. After the commercial disappointment of the Layla album, it was a critical darling but a slow seller at first. The Dominos fell apart. The intense pressure and personal demons were too much. But there was more to the story than just the band's inner turmoil. There were rumors of an enormous betrayal that added to the collapse. According to Whitlock himself, the band's manager, Robert Stigwood, essentially took all of the money and funneled it into the formation of a new record label, RSO Records, using their funds to sign and record other artists. This financial SHT show, as Whitlock put it, meant the band's money was gone, leaving them in a dire situation. Clapton would later struggle with addiction for years, while the Dominos drummer, Jim Gordon, spiraled into a deep decline that ultimately led to him taking the life of his own mother. The dream that was Derek and the Dominos ended in heartbreak, financial ruin, and personal devastation for all involved. When Derek and the Dominos dissolved after just one studio album, Bobby didn't vanish. He just slipped into the shadows of rock history, where his fingerprints were still everywhere. Almost immediately, he found himself in the orbit of George Harrison, contributing to the landmark All Things Must Pass. Those sessions were a who's who of rock royalty, yet Bobby blended in effortlessly, adding depth to tracks without ever demanding center stage. Not long after, he was in the Rolling Stones' inner circle, working on parts of Exile on Main ST, in sessions so secretive that many of his contributions went uncredited. For Bobby, it wasn't about chasing fame. It was about being part of music that mattered. Through the 70s, he launched solo projects, collaborated with Delaney Bramlett, and kept writing songs that would be covered by other artists. But fame can be a double-edged sword. While Clapton's career soared, Bobby's public profile stayed modest. Fans who stumbled upon his work often wondered why they hadn't heard more about him. Still, Bobby seemed content playing his role in shaping the soundtrack of an era. And in the years ahead, he'd reinvent himself yet again, but this time, far away from the spotlight of rock stages. After the Dominos' devastating split, Bobby Whitlock didn't stick around to chase fame. Instead, he made a decision that shocked many. He walked away from the music industry entirely. He retreated to a small farm in Mississippi, far from the pressures and pitfalls of the rock and roll world. For years, he focused on a quiet life, raising his 2 children and living in relative obscurity. When asked about his long absence from the music scene, he said there was simply nothing going on in music that interested him. It was a complete rejection of the wild lifestyle that had nearly consumed him. He found peace in a simple life, a stark contrast to the chaos and tragedy that marked his time with Derek and the Dominos. For decades, he was essentially a ghost of his former self, a rock legend who had vanished, leaving behind a legacy that would only truly be appreciated years later. But even in this quiet time, his creativity didn't disappear. It just found a new and very different outlet. By the time the new millennium rolled in, Bobby Whitlock's life had taken a turn that few would have predicted. The man once known for belting out gritty blues rock anthems was now spending long, quiet hours in a studio, but this time with a paintbrush instead of a microphone. Painting became more than a hobby. It was another way for Bobby to channel the same passion and emotion that had fueled his music. Over the years, he created more than 1,000 works, each with its own story and rhythm. His canvases were often bold and colorful, carrying the same intensity as his songwriting, a visual echo of his music's soul. In 2024, this side of Bobby's life earned public recognition when he was honored with a spot on Memphis's Beale Street Walk of Fame, a fitting tribute to a man who had helped shape the city's musical identity decades earlier. Fans who attended the ceremony got to see a different Bobby, calm, reflective, and deeply grateful. For him, art wasn't just a second act. It was proof that creativity doesn't fade. It just finds new forms. But even as he embraced this quieter chapter, a return to the stage was never completely off the table. After nearly 2 decades away, Bobby Whitlock began his slow return to music in the late 90s. This wasn't a grand, stadium-filling comeback, but a more subtle and personal one. He recorded new albums and found a new partner, Coco Campbell, with whom he would make music for the rest of his life. But what most people don't know is that his creativity had found another, completely different outlet during his time away. Throughout his years in rural Mississippi, he became an incredibly prolific painter. He created a staggering number of works, over 2,000, according to his wife. His paintings were a world away from the bluesy angst of Derek and the Dominos. They were vibrant, colorful, and often depicted animals and rural life, reflecting the peaceful existence he'd found. He was a two-headed creative force, a rock and roll veteran who could still write and perform with raw passion, and a visual artist with a unique style. He was a true rock star who was able to escape the machine, and in doing so, he rediscovered a creative self that was all his own. And as we'll see, it was this peaceful, creative life that brought him to the end of his journey. In interviews over the last decade, Bobby often spoke with a mix of pride and quiet resignation about his place in music history. He knew he'd been part of moments that changed rock forever, but he also knew the spotlight had mostly shone elsewhere. And that was fine with him. Bobby described himself as a working musician, someone who played because he loved it, not because he needed the validation. He often said that fame was a tricky game, and that it could take more than it gave. What mattered to him was the craft, the collaboration, and the feeling of making something timeless. His partnership with Coco Camel, both in music and in life, seemed to bring him a sense of peace he hadn't always known in his younger years. Together, they released music, toured on their own terms, and built a home where creativity was part of the daily rhythm. Looking back, Bobby didn't dwell on the missed headlines or uncredited parts. Instead, he seemed grateful to have survived the chaos of the 70s, grateful for the music and grateful for the people who still remembered his work. But as his health quietly began to fail, even those closest to him couldn't have imagined how quickly the final chapter would come. Even without constant headlines, Bobby Whitlock's work continued to ripple through the music world. His solo albums from Bobby Whitlock in 1972 to later projects with Coco Camel showcased a voice and songwriting style that aged like fine whiskey, deeper, more textured, and unshakably authentic. Artists across generations have cited him as an influence, often tracing their love for raw, emotional rock back to the songs he helped create. Tracks like Any Day and Bell Bottom Blues remain staples for musicians looking to blend blues grit with melodic beauty, a balance Bobby mastered effortlessly. And while his name might not have been as instantly recognizable as Clapton's or Harrison's, those who dug into the liner notes knew exactly who he was. To them, Bobby was a musician's musician, the kind of artist whose work spoke loudest in the hands of others who truly understood its worth. When news of his passing broke, it wasn't just fans who mourned. Fellow musicians, producers, and engineers flooded social media with stories of a man who played not for fame, but for the music itself. That's the kind of legacy no chart position can measure. But to really understand Bobby's story, you have to see the arc from his earliest struggles to his final, quiet moments, and that's where his life takes on an even deeper meaning. From the dirt streets of Memphis to the hallowed halls of rock history, Bobby Whitlock's journey was anything but ordinary. He was the kid who broke barriers at Stax Records, the songwriter who poured his soul into Layla, the collaborator trusted by legends, and the artist who found peace in painting after decades in music's fast lane. And yet, for all the iconic moments he helped create, Bobby never seemed to chase the kind of fame that burns bright and fast. Instead, he built a legacy quietly, through music that still stirs emotions, through art that reflects his inner world, and through the love he shared with those closest to him. His death at 77 closes the final chapter on a life filled with both struggle and triumph. But if there's one thing his story proves, it's that you don't need the spotlight to leave a lasting mark. The real measure of Bobby Whitlock isn't in awards or magazine covers. It's in the songs that refuse to fade, and the memories he left behind for those lucky enough to know his work. So, next time Layla plays, listen closely. Somewhere in the chords, in the spaces between the notes, you might just hear Bobby, still playing, still singing, and still telling his story. If you learned something new about Bobby Whitlock today, hit that subscribe button, because there are more untold stories like this one that deserve to be heard.